This is one of the best known themes of the 1970s to 90s, and it always makes me smile. And that's not just because it's good. It's because the person who wrote it was my dad, Leonard Salzedo. He wrote lots of pieces and I want them to be better known. So I decided to make this film for the centenary of his birth.
In 1959, when Philip Jones and I were both members of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, Philip asked me to write a piece for his newly formed brass ensemble, and I wrote my divertimento. 1970, my mother phoned me up and said they're using your brass divertimento as a 6-digit tune for the Open University, and I said, no, you can't be right, that must be wrong. But when I put it on, it was correct.
Last year, the LPO played it, and this is what Principal Trumpet Paul Beniston said.
The first piece that occurred to me was the Salzedo divertimento, because it's for 3 trumpets and 3 trombones. In his program notes, he makes it sound very simple. He says that the first movement's based on the 7-note theme. And if you look closely, it is, but it's based on a sequence of rising triads. So immediately 2 into 3 doesn't go. So you get overlapping intervals, and also because the notes are in pairs, you've got a 7-note pattern, which means that on the second repetition, what was the first note becomes the second note. So he makes it sound very simple, but that opening is somehow very enigmatic, and rhythmically it's a bit ambiguous. It hovers between F major and B flat major. Sometimes it's a feeling of being modal. And after that it's a very lively, almost dancey movement. Full of energy and also great effective brass writing. He writes sort of bell effects where he builds up textures with accented notes, and it's just fabulously crafted.
It's all extremely well written and it's entirely representative of him. It's a quintessential piece of his music. I think he was delighted that it was so popular. Some of the variations, they're very witty. He brings in Hispanic rhythms, which he does with a lot of his music. And I think that's what gives it its unique quality, really, that he was able to draw on his Hispanic and Sephardic back heritage in a lot of his music. And it's very, very colourful. He's very good at telling stories in his music as well. It's a strong narrative quality. Maria Rombert, I think, heard his second string quartet, and on the strength of the quartet, she thought, oh, you're a born ballet writer. So there must be a dramatic quality in his concert music as well, that she was able to spot that. And he wrote 17 ballets.
His first ballet for Rombert was The Fugitive, the start of a collaboration that lasted 30 years.
I was an avid balletomaine, and of course I went to the Rambert. That was where I first saw Leonard's ballets. I think the first one must have been The Fugitive, and it was probably the first night because I was an avid first nighter, and I'm sure he took a bow. So Leonard and his music were always important to me.
His most successful ballet was The Witch Boy.
The Witch Boy, which I wrote in 1955 for a Dutch company, and it was an immediate success. And the following year it was taken up by the Festival Ballet, who first performed it in this country in November 1957. Been in the repertoire for about 12 different companies in different parts of the world.
It's a terrific score. It's a score that ought to be heard not just in the theatre, but in the concert hall, because people would suddenly remember that, this is a composer with enormous skill. The nuts and bolts of how to put pieces together, he had down to a fine art. And the logic of his musical structures is always very clear to a listener as well as to somebody who scrutinizes the score, which is what you would like to happen, but doesn't always.
He was very pleased with the success of Witch Boy. That was another favourite piece of his, and the Suite from it, which he recorded for Classic for Pleasure. And it's a very striking piece. Again, it's very colourful, interesting use of vibraphone. It's a very well orchestrated piece.
You became musical director of the Ballet Rambert.
Yes, that was when they changed the company from being a classical company to being a smaller company doing mainly contemporary ballets with contemporary music. And I'd just written a score for them, which was due for first performance. And so they asked me if I'd like to be musical director. That was in 1966. And I was with them for 5.5 years.
What influence did that have on your writing?
The Ballet Rambert at that time had a very avant-garde repertoire, including music by Schoenberg, Stockhouse, and Berio, Zenakis. And I was able to come to grips with these composers in a way which I hadn't before, and I learned a lot from them about what could be done.
In the mid-60s, we created a program for children called Bertrand Battle's Sideshow. Bertrand Battle was an anagram of Ballet Rambert. I hadn't choreographed anything before. I'm not sure how I had the nerve to ask Leonard to commission a score for me, but I did. So Leonard did write a score for a little piece I choreographed called Cobweb. Because his music had a very contemporary feel about it, I think it was quite kind of relevant for the period that Rambert moved into.
So who was this man who, while working as a violinist and then a conductor, wrote nearly 200 pieces over 55 years of composing? Who I remember sitting at the desk he built for himself, writing by hand, and looking as if he was in another world. Leonard Salzedo was born on the 24th of September 1921 in London. His father Samuel was a Sephardic Jew who had been born in 1872 to Dutch immigrant parents. By the 1920s, Samuel was a court interpreter and translator who spoke 16 languages and had an office in Chancery Lane. He was also a socialist, an atheist, and an amateur violinist who wrote a book on Paganini. He had scandalized his family by rejecting his Orthodox religious upbringing and in 1920 marrying a non-Jew, Edna Kilroe, who was 28 years his junior. Leonard was an only child, and the relationship between his parents was tense and difficult for most of his young life. For my father, I think music was a companion, a sanctuary, and a calling. When he was 13, he bought a book of manuscript paper and started composing. A star student at the Royal College of Music, he won the Cobbett Prize for Composition for his first string quartet, and in 1943, Princess Elizabeth presented him with the Tagore Gold Medal, awarded to the best student of the year. He was prolific during those war years, despite bombs falling, shortages, and his service in the Home Guard. In March 1945, he met Pat Clover when he was playing Haydn music for Strindberg's Easter at the Gateway Theatre, Notting Hill, and she was assistant stage manager. They married in the May. In 1946, Pat and Leonard joined Ballet Negre, Britain's first black ballet company, which had been formed by Berto Pasuca and Richie Riley.
When I was quite young, I worked with a company called the Ballet Negro Ballet, and they had black African drummers, and I played the piano, so I learned a lot about the African drumming from them. And in fact, the film has just been made this year, which was premiered a few weeks ago. It's called Ballet Black.
One of the first things I discovered, having played Western music, is that we don't play in time. The African music is absolutely metronomic. Within that, they can express things marvellously. But there is no change of tempo at all. It doesn't get faster or slower. Once you've hit something, that's it.
From the 1950s, he was a violinist in the London Philharmonic Orchestra and then the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. In the 1980s, he wrote a viola concerto for Richard Crabtree, which Richard will play again at the Leonard Salzedo concert in London in September 2022.
It's for vibraphone and harp and strings, and that's unusual because Leonard's music has it's unique, isn't it, the way it sounds. But yes, he explained about how the concerto, why he wanted to add the colours of the tuned percussion instruments. I mean, he was clever in that way, you see, because the concerto doesn't sound like for the viola and strings because you've got the colours of the harp and the vibraphone. It sounds slightly more orchestral, and yet with limited numbers, so much easier to perform. One of his techniques Bartók used, where you'd have a melody line and he would play the second note an octave higher or an octave lower, so it gave a wide acoustic range to a melody.
In the 1990s, he met violist Elizabeth Turnbull.
Knowing that I played in the Archaeus Quartet, Leonard asked if we would be interested in playing his 7th string quartet.
The 7th quartet was absolutely enthralling. All the different techniques he used, the musical inventiveness, the interplay of the instruments, and I could hear straight away how well he could express the character of the instruments he was working with.
Anne Hooley, first violinist, and I asked him if he'd ever considered writing a duo. 3 weeks later, he presented us with a score of this wonderful sonata for violin and viola, dedicated to us. His knowledge of string playing was so profound that if you felt and understood his music, it played itself. Not that it was easy, though the difficulties were always possible. He was very true to his own ideas and did not alter these for the sake of popularity or critical approval. His music has rhythmic impact, haunting Sephardic melodies and architectural structure. There are many wonderful works, and sadly not enough has been recorded. I treasure the 5th string quartet and feel that this is a great 20th century work for this medium.
And he particularly singled out string quartet number 5. It seems to summarise all his qualities. It's beautifully written, as all his string music is, but for the players. And it's got beautiful melodies in it as well, and a very strong rhythm, which is part of his musical character, I think.
What I love about Leonard as a composer is how tuned in he is to the character and the voice of the instruments he writes for. He just understands their sound qualities so well and how well they interact with one another.
From the 1960s, my father collaborated with poet John Cromer, who he met through John's partner, then wife, Patricia.
Leonard, in his autobiography, says, "In the spring 1961, I had a letter from Patricia Millard, that was my then name, who is a distant cousin of mine, but whom I never met. She introduced me to John Vaughan. He was a lawyer by profession, but was also an author and poet with the pen name John Cromer. Leonard wrote a mini opera with words by John on the theme of Lizzie Borden. The first performance took place in 1969, I think. Of course, I would love to hear Lizzie Borden done again.
Because because he was a player himself, and he played within ensembles and he played within orchestras. I think he brought something very special to composing. He had an appreciation of folk technique, and I think that came across in the way that he set words. It was very thoughtful, very lyrical. They were challenging, but they were never hard to sing.
Another Cromer Salzedo song was "The Wind at Morning," performed by Alison Young at the commemorative concert for my father in September 2001. In May 2018, my sister Sue and I set up the Leonard Salzedo Society to promote his music. His nearly 200 works are in the library at the Royal College of Music. Mike Ladouceur is involved in the project to get Salzedo's scores digitised and out there.
Realized that we were sitting on this gigantic archive at the college. One of the first big projects that we had copied was all of his string quartets. He's a very textural writer, which is something I really enjoy. And I also think it's quite unique to his style.
He wasn't in any way boastful about his writing, but I would say he had a quiet confidence in the quality of it. He knew he'd written something worthwhile.
There was a lot of music written in the 20th century where people were ashamed to write any consonant chord. Then there's no harmonic resolution of anything, and the great composers at the time all knew perfectly well what was going on, but struck out for a harmonic language that made some sense. People like Benjamin Britten and Dmitri Shostakovich. And Leonard was of that tribe, and a very good tribe it was.
One of the main questions is, somebody who has had such a prolific output and such a fantastic career like Benjamin Britten or Vaughan Williams, how does that music get lost?
He has this common touch, which isn't common in a derogatory sense, and he can manage to write a tune that you can remember after a first hearing, and I think he's due for a serious revival.
Here's to us all.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's to us all.
Happy birthday.
Yes.